now setting in as, like other Americans, national security officials, intelligence officials, the first thing they felt when they saw what's happening and what we're looking at on our screen here was shock. But that is turning now to anger. And when I asked whether there were considerations being given to some sort of retaliation against targets in Afghanistan, one official said, "I wouldn't be planning your vacation there if I were you."
David Ensor, just quickly, when they describe this new and specific information, do you know enough about the kinds of sources or the kinds of the methods here that you could characterize where this information might be coming from or in what form?
Well, they are not saying anything specific about exactly what the nature of this information is, as you can expect, Judy. However, when I talk to officials about the kinds of information that they would be gathering now, they confirm that that information includes passenger lists of the aircraft that were downed, videotape at airports from cameras, from security cameras in the airports. In a few days, they will have cockpit recordings. And there's also a limited number of people who are suspected of belonging to terrorist groups who are known to be able to fly aircraft. And it looks as if at least some of the personnel involved in this plot must have been able to do that in order to carry off this set of attacks, Judy.
Absolutely chilling to hear you say that, David, that there are people in these organizations, and we now know it, who could fly commercial jetliners to do these horrible, unspeakable acts that have been committed today in the United States. And now, as we look at live pictures of New York City, where the smoke still billows from the location of the World Trade Center's buildings that were 100 stories high, now completely decimated. Smoke coming from those buildings 6 hours after the collapse of these Twin Towers. To Atlanta and to my colleague Joey Chin.
Joey, thank you. Shimon Peres, the Israeli foreign minister, has been active in Israeli governments for as long as most of us can remember, and has witnessed more of these terrorist attacks than any of us should experience. He joins us now to talk about this one. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you.
Before, sir, we get to any of the specific questions, let me just ask you first, if I may, for a reaction to what has taken place here.
Our heart is with America.
You have been privy to some of the most detailed intelligence reports there are out there. Are you surprised by the sophistication that must have been at play to carry out these attacks? I hope you'll answer this. Let me ask it anyway. Did the government of Israel have any intelligence prior, any indications prior that something like this might happen? The logical follow-up, which is, since the attacks themselves, has Israeli intelligence picked up any information that suggests who might be involved in this? In your mind that the root of this attack on the United States today, the root of it took place in the Middle East, that the events in the Middle East, the organizations in the Middle East, do you believe that to be the case? Levin, thank you, sir, for joining us. We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing. And you, to be honest, can see these pictures a little bit more clearly than I, but building number 7, one of the buildings in this very large complex of buildings that is the Trade Center, there were, and that is the right way to put it, there were the 2 towers, but then there are a number of support buildings around it, retail spaces, restaurants, office space, garages. The trains come in from New Jersey, bringing commuters, taking commuters back, come into the complex that is the World Trade Center, and now we are told that there's a fire there, and that building may collapse as well, as you can see. We can see, as we look now back downtown, we can see the billowing smoke. It is extraordinary to us, I guess, is how long this scene has gone on. The smoke has not cleared at all. It has not lightened at all. There was that horrific moment when the towers collapsed And then we've been in this sort of situation ever since as the fires continue to burn. Rose Arce, one of our producers who has been slowly and diligently making her way to the building, described the fires that she saw in the area of the towers themselves. And clearly those fires continue to burn at about 4:15 Eastern Daylight Time today in an unbelievable and awful scene in New York. Judy?
Aaron, because I think the belief had been that there were just the two towers, but you're now telling us that there are several other buildings that make up the complex of buildings, and as Aaron is just saying, and we're hearing for the first time, one of these support buildings is on the verge of collapse if it has not already collapsed. It looks to me, as it may to Aaron as well with these live pictures, that smoke is so black that it may be the result of a fresh part of this terrible disaster. But it is only speculation at this point. We evidently don't have anyone on the phone down there that we can get to right this moment, but of course when we do, we will tell you what is going on. We do know that every effort is being made by New York emergency authorities to get people out, but you also heard our producer Rose Arce say not too long ago that even the emergency personnel cannot get close because debris is falling at a steady rate within a 2-block radius around the Trade Center, and even their most heartfelt efforts to get in there and rescue people, they just can't do it because the risk is too great. We're going to continue to watch this horrific scene in New York City. At least that's my understanding. But members of Congress, after these buildings were hit, were quickly evacuated. And some of them have been gathering. There was a report not too long ago that at 6 o'clock today Eastern Time that there would be a conference call of the congressional leadership to assess the catastrophe of today and to consider when the United States Congress should meet again. As of now, the Capitol was largely evacuated. CNN's Kate Snow is at a location near the Capitol, and she's been talking constantly to members and to members of the staff. Kate, what are you learning?
Judy, we are still under a lockdown at the Capitol. We've been told that Senator Lott and Senator Daschle would like to call the Senate back into session this afternoon. They would like to do that. Whether that's going to be a possibility is unclear at this point. Joining me here a couple of blocks away from the Capitol is Senator Bob Graham, Democrat from Florida and the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. You hold a position where you are in the know, Senator. Tell us, what do you know at this point about the events that have transpired today? Have you been briefed yet?
Kate, we're about to have a briefing. The head of the CIA has been briefing the cabinet and the other key officials to the president this afternoon, and he's going to be talking to members of Congress on the intelligence committees and leadership shortly. It's
been reported, our David Ensor has reported, that there are strong indications that this could be linked to Osama bin Laden. Do you personally believe that that could be the case?
Kate, I think it's premature to start naming a prime suspect. If you'll recall, after the Oklahoma City bombing, there was an early identification of an Arab group that had done it. Turned out to be false. Let's withhold until we get a little more information. My own sense is that there are not very many groups around the world who have the capability of planning, coordinating, and executing a terrorist attack of this sophistication.
You are constantly being briefed by the FBI, by the CIA, by the National Security Agency. You are one of the senators that knows the most about our national security. Do you believe that there was any advance warning of this attack?
No. If there had been advance warning, there would have been steps taken to have interdicted it. There had been a general threat warning that there was a greater likelihood of some terrorist attack somewhere in the United States, but it was not at a sufficiently detailed level to allow for some response.
And when was that general warning?
Early in the summer, there was a general announcement of an increase in threat level for terrorism.
And were there changes made then to our security? Tell me about that.
Yes, there were general steps taken in terms of our intelligence gathering, particularly related to those that we had the highest level of suspicion. greater security at key vulnerable areas, and I'm certain that the military was placed at a somewhat higher level of alert.
Were you then surprised as you sat in your office? You told me you were here this morning, you were on Capitol Hill when the first word started coming down about what happened in New York. Were you surprised?
Well, the answer is I was shocked at what actually happened, that the extent of it, the gruesomeness, the audaciousness of this kind of an aerial attack against some of our best known symbols of America. I was not surprised that there was an attack, was surprised at the specificity of this one.
Does the Senate now, to show that the Senate can get on with business and that the U.S. Congress has not been impeded, do you think the Senate ought to come back and get back to business to send that signal?
Well, I think first, as all Americans, we need to extend our sympathy to the families that have been so tragically affected by this. We also need to send a signal to the world that a group of terrorists cannot intimidate the greatest democracy in the history of the globe, and that we will continue to carry out our responsibilities.
And at this briefing, you told me within the hour, before 5 o'clock Eastern, you expect to talk not only with intelligence, FBI, but also with your colleagues, the leadership. And I understand some decisions are going to be made about how to proceed from here.
Well, I think what we'll be getting at this briefing is some more detail as to what happened today. But there clearly are some things that we have known that need to be undertaken for our long-term protection. For instance, we need to make a greater investment in human intelligence. That's old-fashioned spies that can get close to a terrorist, find out what their intentions and motivations are. We need to see that our technical ability to gather information stays as world-class as it has been for the last 50 years, and we need to close the gap between the amount of information we gather and that which we're able to analyze and convert into useful intelligence.
Okay. Senator Bob Graham, Democrat from Florida, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, joining us here. He's about to receive a briefing, Judy, and we will get back to you with word when we know more from here. Judy?
All right, Kate, we've been listening closely to what Senator Graham was saying, and I would just remind everyone, if they haven't already taken note of this, that this week is actually the anniversary of the Camp David Accords. Those took place back in 1978, 23 years ago, over a period of about a little more than a week between September 5th and about the 17th. This was the framework for peace in the Middle East, an agreement between Israel and Egypt that many of the more hardline Arab states said they would never forgive Egypt and certainly Israel for doing this. They felt betrayed by it, and there are those today suggesting perhaps that had something to do with the timing, although at this point it would be purely speculation to say one way or another. You're continuing to see pictures of the terrible devastation in New York City in the aftermath of the 2 airplanes that flew into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. There are adjacent buildings, part of the World Trade Center complex, that are still very much at risk. One of these buildings may have collapsed or may be in the process of collapsing. Aaron Brown, back to you in Manhattan.
Judy, thank you. Jim DeStefano is a structural engineer. He knows about big buildings and what happens in these sort of catastrophic moments. He joins us from Deerfield, Connecticut on the phone. Jim, the plane hits. And I hope this isn't a terribly oversimplified question, but what happens to the building itself? Well, it's a structure.
Yeah, it's a tremendous impact that's applied to the building when a collision like this occurs. And it's clear that that impact was sufficient to do damage to the columns and the bracing system supporting the building. That, coupled with the fire raging and the high temperatures softening the structural steel, then precipitated a destabilization of the columns, and clearly the columns buckled.
6 or 7 hours now, shown you some extraordinary pictures. Many of those pictures have come from the air. We have seen the plane hitting the tower. We've seen the tower collapse. In this day and age, lots of people walk around this city, and every city, I guess, with video cameras, and one of them today in Lower Manhattan was Dr. Mark Heath. Dr. Heath kept rolling, as we say in the news business, and this is what he saw with as little commentary from us as possible.
hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help, because I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. Can I just get a toot off your respirator? Yeah. Can I get a toot? I'm just in a couple of clean breaths. That's good. Okay. Back to you. This is the car I hid behind. It saved my life. Wait, maybe it was this one. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Oxygen. Don't have oxygen.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks. They told me just to wait here at this semi-staging area. See if I can help, so that's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. So far, I just seen some people who needed oxygen from the dust. No one trauma. Gonna go wash my eyes out. Yeah, that almost made it work. Looking north on the West Side Highway. You guys going in?
Yeah.
Come with you. You know, you might not want to get too much closer, because the more buildings could come down, then we're not going to help anybody.
All right.
I think we should. Yeah.
Where's the incident come out?
Let's just. Yeah. Okay. Let's just wait right here. Let's just station up right here. Okay.
All right, Doc.
Why don't we set up? Can you hang IVs from this pole here?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
We just heard another explosion. They're handing out gloves and masks. The consensus is it's too unsafe to go in there. Just gonna wait here until they bring some people out. I was hooked up with some firemen with some first aid stuff.
What are we doing?
You know what?
Anything?
Why don't we just set this up as a little mobile hospital unit right here, okay?
Hold on to tie again to all units that are available. We're having a new command post on Murray Street and West Street. Any units
Suggestion, should we set up here for medical work? Think this is safe enough here?
Those pictures shot by Dr. Mark Heath. We don't know much about Dr. Heath, but we, I think, can fairly say that he had extraordinary presence of mind as he continued not only shooting those pictures, but also offering assistance where he could. At one point, he hid behind a car, tried to get into the car to protect himself from both the debris and the smoke that was building around him. The car was locked. He tried to break in, couldn't, and then hid his face in a medical bag, his medical bag. All the while he kept shooting. A couple of things that you might have wondered about, a couple of sounds. There was a chirping sound that you heard at various points in the tape. That is the sound of the locator devices that firemen and women wear so that if they are lost in a fire, their colleagues, their brother and sister firefighters can get to them. And there was also a kind, what sounded to us at least, like a kind of whistling sound. That's the sound of respirators that the firemen, the emergency service personnel, and the rest were using and offering to people who needed it. Our colleagues at CNN-FN are reporting now that the stock exchanges, the NASDAQ, the American Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, all of course closed today, will remain closed through Wednesday. So the stock markets, the financial markets in the country, and yet again, we cannot recall anything like that ever occurring. Perhaps it has, and we don't remember it, but we don't remember it. The stock markets, all of them, stay closed through Wednesday. Air travel shut down in the United States until at least noon tomorrow, and certainly no guarantee it'll open after that. That affects, on an average, about 1.5 million people every single day, 40 to 50,000 flights, all of them grounded. There were about 50,000, there were about 50 planes in the air after the FAA essentially locked down airports in the country. All of those planes made it safely to destinations. We don't know they made it to the destinations they were headed for, but they were all able to land safely. CNN's Joey Chin in Atlanta. Joey?
Aaron, we're following and watching these extraordinary...
And I saw debris start to fall down. I was so close to the building that I couldn't run away from the building, so I actually had to run towards it. And if you know, the World Financial Center has got a rib design, so you actually have a 2x2 space where you can actually...
Prudent to just focus on the rescue efforts today, and also to ask ourselves, you know, how did this happen? And kind of break down the operation and show people that this was a very low-tech but high-concept operation on the part of the terrorists.
Well, describe that for us. What do you mean by that? High concept.
Well, what I mean by that is, you know, Americans tend to rely on high tech. We look to high tech to solve most of our problems. Terrorists don't have high tech at their disposal to the degree that a government such as the United States has. But unfortunately, they have a lot of time. An operation such as this may have been years in the making. We don't know yet how this operation was able to go forward, but let's just, you know, break down the steps. I took a few notes on it. At some point, we all recognized that there was some intelligence failure, that, you know, we've got to do better. We've done good in the past, we've improved our ability to defeat terrorism, but we're not perfect yet, and this is an example of that, to be sure. But then what happened was, the question is, how did these people get some sort of weapon onto an airplane? You know, I'm sure the FAA and the Department of Transportation and all the airports from which these aircraft were launched this morning will be taking a really hard look at that, and I'm sure we'll see some changes in the future.
Not an airplane, Mr. Beatty. I mean, 4 aircraft. That's an awful lot in different locations.
Exactly. This is a highly sophisticated approach, you know, but it's not the first time we've seen that. We've seen foreign groups destroy 2 embassies within moments of each other a couple of years ago on the continent of Africa. So we know that our opponent is capable of this type of operation, and he demonstrated it today on our homeland. The interesting thing here, Joey, you didn't need to bring across hundreds of pounds of explosives across a border someplace to commandeer an airplane. Why did they choose these airplanes? They picked these wide-body airplanes. The fact that the World Trade Center was prepared to sustain a hit from a 707 was not a well-kept secret. They picked airplanes that were bigger than that. Also, they picked airplanes that took off from the East Coast, headed to the West Coast, that were big airplanes full of fuel. They weren't interested in killing people on the airplanes. The airplane themselves became the bomb. And so they didn't need to bring explosives into the country. We don't know yet whether it was knives or handguns or whatever. But the next question in the step as we break down the operational acts in this attack is, how did these people get weapons onto the aircraft? And then from there, to continue it, the question is asked, what about a cockpit incursion? How is it that they were able to get into the cockpits of the aircraft, take over the controls, and as we know and have heard in the past that there are transponder codes that pilots can send if an aircraft is hijacked. From what I understand, we didn't get some of that yet, so we have to assume that the cockpits were burst into rather quickly. And I heard Judy Woodruff and others earlier infer, and I join them in drawing the same inference, that it's highly doubtful that the pilots of these aircraft, the United Airlines pilots and the American Airline pilots, were at the controls of these aircraft when they impacted their targets. So we have got to assume and infer that people capable of flying the aircraft, and remember these aircraft are on duty all over the world, these perpetrators no doubt rehearsed this operation, rehearsed breaking into the cockpit and other locations, that they were probably piloted to the target by people capable of flying a military or a jet aircraft.
Well,
Do you think, I mean, I have to interrupt you to ask, do you think that perhaps in looking at the possibility of terror threats, I mean, certainly terror threats have come to this country in the past, and I'm wondering if you think perhaps we were thinking too high concept. We thought of something more elaborate, and perhaps intelligence should have been focused on this kind of low-tech approach. I suppose hindsight is 20/20, but I think there's a lot of good in what you're pointing out, Joey. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, we cannot just focus all our energies on weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, etc. We've all been talking about that, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on that in recent years. But this didn't use any weapon of mass destruction, and I'm afraid that the casualty tally could approach 5 figures. And that means that we've got to beat these people, not only high tech, but we've got to be high concept. It means we've got to work harder in planning than we have up to this point. And I know that we will. And if I could say a word about the people at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon, we've had the privilege in my company to work to support both organizations. We've trained every security officer at both locations. They knew what they were up against. They knew that they were icons, American icons, that were likely to be targeted. Excuse me, it's been an emotional day, plus it's a little hot out here. Likely to be targeted. And they did their best. But they were only one part of a system, as we've just outlined. You know, Doug Karpiloff, the Director of Life Safety and Security for the World Trade Center, is probably one of the premier security people in our country. Doug was always afraid of a scenario where there was a mass casualty incident at the World Trade Center and hundreds of emergency vehicles would rush to the scene. They don't have the ability to check all those vehicles to make sure that they don't pose a threat. So we're yet to determine, we've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
Mr. Beatty, we appreciate all of your insight. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave you. There are still further developments on this story. Jeffrey Beatty's company is involved in counterterrorism information, and he joined us this afternoon from Dallas. Now let's go back to New York for the latest information there, and Aaron Brown.
Joey, thank you. A couple of things. The president is en route back to Washington, we are now told. The president had started his day in Sarasota, Florida, then went to Shreveport, a military base outside Shreveport, then went to Nebraska, where the Strategic Air Command is located, and now he is making his way back to Washington. And we are told the president will address the nation at some point tonight. We do not know at what time, but of course, when it happens, we will carry that live as well. We're also getting reports that a second building in the complex of the Trade Center, and again, you have the 2 towers, but then you have a number of support buildings around it, that another of those buildings, we reported a bit ago on Building 7, we now report that there are problems in Building 5, and that may be collapsing as well, but at least there is fire there. There are enormous logistical problems. We just looked down what is 8th Avenue behind us here, which is normally at this time of the day packed with cars. This is rush hour, people trying to get out of the city. It is empty, and the city, in at least this part of the city, Manhattan, is shut down, which means that thousands of people who were trying to get home, trying to get to the suburbs, trying to get to Long Island, trying to get to New Jersey particularly. That's where those trains, what are called the PATH trains, come into New Jersey, from New Jersey rather, at the Trade Center. All of them stranded here. CNN's Richard Roth is down on the streets of New York and is talking to some of the people who I suspect are wondering when they will get home. Richard?
People that you would have seen in locations you were just examining, many thousands are here right now on the west side of Manhattan trying to, he called it one of the most heinous acts in United States history. He says he fears that the death toll may be more than New York can bear. He asked all New Yorkers to say a prayer. He said a rescue effort was beginning, but as we were told by one official with the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, there is so much jet fuel, furniture, paper, everything still going on up in smoke. He didn't want to send in his people to begin any type of detailed rescue effort. There are reports of some people alive, many dead down there. Scores, hundreds of emergency vehicles with their sirens have been roaring down Manhattan's west side here to the scene, carrying federal security people, all kinds. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said that there are more than 1,000 people taken to what's known as Liberty State Park, the walking wounded, he called them, several hundred, 600 or so in New York City hospitals. And the mayor said that there are 170 hospitals that are up and running, and other buildings are helping out for support. U.S. jet fighters overhead, circling occasionally, people craning their necks, looking up in the sky. Everybody's got a memory, everybody's got a story here. I personally saw Trade Tower #1, where CNN's New York bureau used to be in the lobby 17, 18 years ago, come tumbling down, and I was part of a stampede as people just raced for their lives as the smoke came closer and closer to all of us. That was after Tower #2 had gone down. You couldn't even see what was left of it, if anything was standing, due to all of the smoke. Aaron.
Richard, just help orient me for a second. Tell me where you are in the city right now as you talk to us.
We're on approximately 33rd Street on the west side of Manhattan. The Hudson River is just behind our camera position here, and it is an orderly departure here. I mean, you can see for yourself, people are just, they left work, or a very normal day in New York City.
It certainly is not, Richard. Thank you. It is, I don't know if remarkable is the right word, but it's worth noting again that in every picture that we have seen from the scene, the people who had just experienced the most horrendous imaginable thing were remarkably orderly and calm as they left the area. I don't want to suggest for a second that there wasn't any panic, that there wasn't any screaming. These are human beings, and human beings behave in a variety of ways. But every picture we have seen, New Yorkers calmly, if that's the right word, calmly left the scene, moved out of the area. No reports of trouble at all as firefighters and police personnel came down into the city. Scores, hundreds of civilians started to move out. And they are still calmly moving out. We suspect there is some sense of shock. The city is faced with, and as Richard alluded to, is moving people around. You have essentially a shutdown going on here. In some of the outlying areas, city governments are trying to support the city as best they can. Tom Swayze is the mayor of Glen Cove out on Long Island. Tom, I think you're on the phone. Mr. Mayor, can you hear me?
Yes, this is Tom Swayze, mayor of the city of Glen Cove.
Tom, tell us what Glen Cove is doing to support the efforts going on here in Manhattan.
We have high-speed ferries that operate from Glen Cove to Pier 11 down by Wall Street. And we've already evacuated about 1,200 people with the help of Fox Navigation from New York City out here back to the island. We are now working at the request of Commissioner Carrick to try and bring emergency personnel, doctors, nurses, back into Manhattan to try and help relieve some of these doctors and nurses that are going to start getting very exhausted at the area hospitals down on the southern tip of Manhattan.
And is there a number people should call or a location they ought to go to if they are medical personnel and can help in the effort down there, where they can get on one of these ferries and come on down?
We'd like them to come to the end of Glen Cove Road, the northern end of Glen Cove Road in Glen Cove, to the parking lot across from our police station, the end of Glen Cove Road, across from the Glen Cove police station, where we will take them by bus down to the ferry terminal. If they want to call for information, they should call the ferry terminal itself at 609-3342, 609-3342. We're coordinating with the Nassau County and Suffolk County emergency management offices as well. But right now we need to get emergency-type personnel, doctors, nurses, EMTs. We know everybody wants to help, but we're not looking for just regular volunteers who mean well, and we appreciate their interest. We're looking for professionals who can go into Manhattan and be prepared to work.
Tom, thank you for joining us and for your efforts today. I apologize for mispronouncing your name a moment ago. Thank you. Judy in Washington.
Aaron, we're here in the Washington studio.
And so you have to have that, and that's the critical aspect of moving through a crisis of this kind.
And we've heard from President Bush now at 3 different intervals today, when he was still in Florida, when he moved on to Louisiana, and then a statement when he was in Nebraska. Now we know he's back to Washington. Now let me ask you, he's coming back to the Washington area. We don't know where he's going to go. Vice President Cheney at an undisclosed location. The Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, at an undisclosed location. I'm not asking you to tell us where they are, but what would it be like in one of these locations where they were essentially kept away and kept safe?
Well, all of these installations have been established for precisely this reason. And that means that they're armed with communications, with living facilities, and that's the situation. Now, they don't exercise them all as regularly as I suppose we used to during the nuclear era, but they still exercise them, and they're very, very efficient facilities.
You're saying they don't exercise, presumably because it's felt that the threat isn't as serious in the post-Cold War world?
Well, it's, you know, government is tough, and people are always responding to the crisis of the moment. Usually it's in the first headlines in the daily press. So many times they don't get to go to these relocation sites as often as we'd like, and I used to have to push that when I was in the National Security Council.
The exercises where you would practice what you would do in an emergency. But once they're at the site, I mean, are we talking about very spare surroundings, bare walls, canned goods for food? I mean, what are we talking about?
It varies. It varies. Of course, there's an airborne facility. We all know that there is an airborne facility for the president, and that's Andrews Air Force Base. There are other facilities, some very, very close and some more distant, which were anticipated might be required in a nuclear attack.
What about the lines of communication? You mentioned that. That was the first point you made, that once they're at these locations, there has to be communications. How up to date is all that?
Well, it's kept pretty well up to date. I know, for example, the day President Reagan was shot, it was very clear to me that that command post, that command and control center, had to be in the west basement of the White House or in one of these alternate emergency facilities, because they were equipped to do precisely that. Now, since that time, we've improved the State Department communication facilities, and the Pentagon, of course, is very well equipped in that regard. So there are 3 locations that you could run a crisis from that are known, but there are others.
General Haig, what do you say to those Americans watching this horrific set of circumstances unfold on television before them and wondering, is America safe? Is America safe? Do I feel safe getting on an airplane and flying somewhere? Am I safe to go into a tall building in Manhattan, to walk into a federal building in Washington, D.C., anywhere, whether it's
Joey Miles, thank you. That is a great point. You do wonder if air traffic controllers were ever able to put the pieces together, and if they were, what they must have thought, what went through their minds this morning when they realized that they had not one anomaly, but that they had several going on at the same time, all one heading to Washington and two heading here in New York. CNN's Tim O'Brien has been working the phones, as all of us have been throughout the day, and he joins us from Washington with an extraordinary piece of information on the Pentagon crash. Tim, are you there?
I am. Our understanding is that Barbara Olson was...
How many hijackers were on board the plane? Or at least how many she may have seen?
I asked Ted that. Well, you can imagine. He's surrounded by friends, but this is tough for everybody. It's tough for the country, but it's particularly...
The 200-plus passengers on 4 different airliners, and we have no reason to believe that any of those people survived the crashes today here in New York, in Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, and at the Pentagon in Washington. We still do not have a very good feel, to be perfectly honest, for how many people have died today. We have no particular feel, to be perfectly honest, how many people have been injured. We can only surmise that we are talking in the hundreds, the thousands of people certainly have been injured today. How many of those will survive, we do not yet know. Judy?
And Aaron, this may be another point where we want to say, God,
wholehearted condolences. We are ready to extend whatever aid and assistance is required. War against terror is an international war, a war of a coalition of the free world against all the terror groups and against whoever believes the criminal attack today on innocent civilians in the United States is a turning point in war against international terror. Even if the war against terror is long, and even if the terror will try to raise its head again, there won't be any room in the world in which terrorists, their assistants, and those who send them to be able to find a shelter or a refuge. The government of Israel has decided tomorrow, a mourning day, in a show of solidarity with the American people. I would like to send my condolences to the American people, to President George Bush, and to all the citizens of the United States. In this very difficult hour, our hearts are with you. Could you tell the Israeli public what are the impacts of these attacks on the people here? I have already said very clearly that there will only be a statement. There won't be any other statement apart from what I have already said. We have to wait and see what happened. Our stand vis-a-vis
being a writer of fiction is that you can't keep up with all the madmen in the world as much as you try. And I frankly would have thought that this was not a credible threat to have 4 separate people decide to commit suicide in the same way on the same morning.
Why not?
Because ending your own life is not something the average person does. You know, everybody's assuming these are Islamic terrorists. Well, if so, they've defiled their own religion. You know, Islam does not permit suicide. It says you go to hell if you do something like this.
But we see suicide bombings in the Middle East and in Israel. And
Judy, we saw people in Northern Ireland, Catholics acting like savages and Protestants acting like savages. So anyhow, as a nation, doesn't love our intelligence community. And certainly the news media does not love our intelligence community.
I'm going to interrupt you, Tom Clancy. I'm told Aaron Brown in New York has a development. Aaron?
Well, Judy, another, just in the last few seconds, another building, we will speculate carefully here that there was building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers has collapsed. Those of you who have been with us for a while, you can see indeed that the smoke color has changed has gotten much lighter. So we believe that yet another building, this would be the third building, has collapsed, likely building number 7, although we also heard that there were problems at building number 5, and it's possible that one went down. Again, this occurred just in the last several moments around the Trade Center building. Building number 7, 47 stories. Maureen Madden, CNN producer, is in the air. The first of the towers way back this morning, around 10 or so this morning, and then the second tower, which collapsed shortly thereafter. At least where building number 7 is concerned, a building that, among other things, housed the emergency response team of the city of New York. At least they had some warning. And take a look now. This again was shortly after the first. Wow, oh my gosh. I wonder, this comes to us from PAX TV, I wonder